Any better now? You can hear me now? Okay. I switched microphones this morning and put it on all my screens except for this one right here. So I've been saying all these really interesting, pithy things, and you haven't heard a damn word I said, huh? Oh well. It's about like usual. How's the signal coming through? Is it clear or is it jumpy? You know what I'm going to do? Cut some things off. Close window. Mostly clear, but a little bit jumpy. Okay. I'll just go ahead and switch to the PowerPoint. I'm trying to cut off some of the CPU. There you go. It should have just gotten smooth. Is this better? It should, the CPU usage jumped way down. Okay, I learned another lesson. I can't have the internet open while I'm talking. Apparently it takes up too much of the CPU. Okay, cool. So I hope everybody enjoyed the webinar this week when we talked about consciousness. I know for some of you it was rather weird. Some of you may not have liked it at all. But I hope some of you got something interesting from the webinar. And we were talking about conceptions of the self and where the self really comes from. And I suggested to you that this sense of unitary self that you have, that you're able to walk around and control your consciousness, maybe has it backwards. Maybe your self is created by your consciousness rather than your consciousness creating. Maybe your consciousness creates yourself rather than yourself creates your consciousness. So actually, I have a book that you might find interesting. It's called The Self-Illusion by Bruce Wood, The Self-Illusion. And really, what it does is it goes through and it sort of explains the idea that your self is nothing more than an idea that you develop about yourself. And it really has some interesting insights about how the individual and his or her group and how feedback combines to create that wonderful thing that you feel like is a unified self. Yes, Leanne, that's the idea. You're going to question your life. You're going to wonder, am I really a person? Am I me? And you know what? At the end of the semester, maybe you won't know. It's kind of weird. We all feel like we are in control of our bodies. So I, as a person, control my body. But that's not exactly accurate. And so it's weird when we start looking at things like free will and self-determination, the fantasy sort of breaks down and we begin to see weird aspects of our conscious functioning. Alien 568. Hello, Fiery Fundip 67. He's making me question. Oh, goodness, cool. All right, so it is 11:02. Let's go ahead and get started. Today we're going to talk a little bit about sleep. We're going to introduce the idea of a circadian rhythm. Then I'm going to talk about the different kinds of electricity that your brain generates while you sleep. And we're going to talk about the sleep cycle and how your brain cycles through these different patterns of electrical activity. We're going to talk specifically about REM sleep for a little bit, and then I want to finish up with a couple of minutes on sleep disorders. So let's go ahead and get started. I don't know if you've ever heard the term before, but circadian rhythm refers to the 24-hour cycle of sleeping and waking that humans go through, that animals go through every day. All right, it's a biological process and it changes based upon the time of day. What changes based on the time of day for human beings? Your level of arousal related to cortisol levels in your body, hormone production jumps up and down. Body temperature changes systematically throughout the day. You know what? Your need to urinate even changes systematically every day in this cyclical manner. So humans live in a 24-hour cycle. Now, how do we live in this 24-hour cycle? There are two structures in particular that are important for coordinating our sleep wake cycle. And those are the suprachiasmatic nucleus and the pineal gland. Both structures located adjacent to or sort of in the hypothalamus. Okay, actually the pineal gland is a little bit behind the hypothalamus, but the suprachiasmatic nucleus is actually located in the hypothalamus. Now, your suprachiasmatic nucleus, no, you're not going to have to spell that on the exam. All you're going to have to do is type in SCN. So I'll give you a break there. No need to spell that. Right, electricity in the brain, Riley. So, located in the hypothalamus, this is your master timekeeper. This is the part of your brain that causes you to sleep and wake in a roughly 24-hour period. If you were to lose this structure, you would lose all periodicity in your sleeping. You might sleep for 4 hours and then stay up for 20 hours, then sleep for 25 hours, then get up for 4 hours. This is your master timekeeper. Now, the neat thing about this master timekeeper is it is actually connected to the outside world via some nerve fibers that come from your eye. So this is a part of your non-conscious vision. About 10% of your neural fibers, optic fibers that come out of the eye, go, instead of going to the occipital lobe, they come to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And what happens is as the suprachiasmatic nucleus is getting light information, it releases GABA. And GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It releases GABA on the pineal gland, so the pineal gland can't do its job. Now, when the sun goes down at night, the suprachiasmatic nucleus switches and starts creating glutamate and releasing it at the pineal gland, which causes the pineal gland to release melatonin, which begins your nightly sleep cycle. Okay, does that make sense? So the suprachiasmatic nucleus is actually tied to the sun. And the crazy thing is, there are some people who are blind who do not have these nerve fibers to their suprachiasmatic nucleus, and they have sleep-related problems because their sleep isn't tied to the 24-hour cycle of the sun like most people's are. Okay, yeah, so I see we have a side conversation on how much sleep in the brain. Go ahead and carry on with that. That sounds interesting. Now, the pineal gland, it produces melatonin at night. So when it's activated by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, remember I told you have these modules in the brain and they're all connected. So we have modularity and connectivity. These are two modules that are connected by fibers. And these fibers cause the melatonin to start producing the pineal gland to start producing melatonin, which causes your body temperature to begin dropping and also causes your thalamus to slow down and sort of initiates the sleep and wake cycle. We'll get to the pons in just a little bit. So that's kind of how this cycle occurs. It's a 24-hour cycle, but it's tied into the sun via these little nerve fibers that come from your eyeball. Now, have any of you ever experienced jet lag before? Anybody ever experienced jet lag? And working nights, you know what? Your body's physiological rhythms are still going on, Dee Dee. Even though you sleep during the day, your body is still at its lowest state of arousal and activity at night. There's some things you just can't fight against. So that's the brain physiology, which is probably why you feel crappy at night when you're staying up. So if you've ever experienced jet lag, what happens is your brain's sleep and wake cycle is suddenly changed relative to the sun. So when you travel east or west on a plane, you change yourself relative to the position of the sun by 4 or 6 or maybe even 8 hours. And the crappy feeling that you experience for 2 days is your body's circadian rhythm trying to readjust to the new orientation towards light. And a 28-hour trip to Vietnam is going to leave you all kinds of messed up, right? Okay, and Ash Guth, a flight attendant. Wow, so you're not immune to, where do you fly, Ash K? That's interesting. You must fly overseas if you're experiencing jet lag, or West Coast. Yes, your sleep does change based on the sun. And it's because, if you think about it, human beings are designed to be diurnal, that is, awake during the day, not nocturnal. And there are a lot of theories about why, evolutionary psych theories that try to explain why we might prefer to sleep at night. Some people say it's because we don't have good night vision, and so it's best if we are immobile at night. So one evolutionary psych explanation of why we're attached to the sun and why we're less aroused at night is so that we can be protected and we can hide when we're most at risk. Okay, domestic West Coast. And you still experience Ash Guth. Ashley, is there any way you can just power through it by pretending you don't see the sun and staying up late or going to bed really early when you're on the West Coast and staying up really late when you're on the East Coast? Okay. Now, here's the neat thing. Somebody mentioned electricity in the brain. Here's the crazy thing. The brain's electricity changes throughout the day depending upon our level of arousal and level of activity. So the thing that they use to measure your brain electricity in sleep studies is called an electroencephalogram, an EEG. And it's a tool that allows for the measure of localized electrical activity in the brain. And I think there are 19 electrodes. And these electrodes sort of measure an area of your brain, the electrical activity that's occurring in an area of your brain. So you have some on your frontal lobe, some on your temporal lobe, some on your parietal lobe, and some on your occipital lobe. And they don't measure electricity very specifically. Think of it about it's as accurate as standing outside of NC State's football stadium on Saturday afternoon. You can hear the roar of the crowd, but you don't know exactly what happened and who did what. That's sort of like an EEG. It allows you to hear the roar of electrical activity that brains generate. Now, the neat thing was, it was invented by a Nazi scientist, Hans Berger, he was actually looking for psychic energy in the 1930s, and he discovered the EEG instead. And he was the first person to champion the idea that the brain is always active, even when we're sleeping at night. Before Hans Berger, people believed that the brain just went to sleep and didn't do anything at night. And so it's kind of interesting. A Nazi managed to figure something out, right? So he was the first to champion the idea that the brain is always active. Now, he started measuring brain waves, and the first thing he measured was people when they were kind of at a relaxed state. And he measured these brain waves, and because they were the first waves he measured, he named them alpha waves. And he thought that brains just generated alpha waves. But what he didn't realize was, depending upon the activity that he asked people to do, the brain would generate different kinds of electricity. So they sort of stumbled onto the idea that if you have people focus and think about something, their brain generates a different kind of waveform electricity called beta waves. All right. And so he not only found out the brain generates electricity, but it generates different types of electrical waveforms based upon what we're doing. So when you're relaxed and drowsy, your brain is generating these alpha waves. When you're focused and thinking about my lecture, your brain is generating beta waves. Yeah, Riley, so he accidentally discovered the EEG. It's kind of cool, all the different scientific discoveries that have been made accidentally, or quite accidentally, I would say. Now, Kleitman and DeMint actually won, I think, a Nobel Prize for their work on sleep because they were the first ones to discover this crazy kind of brain activity called REM sleep, and my nose is itching all of a sudden. And they also discovered that the brain generates other types of electrical activity too. So when you finally fall, when you're kind of halfway in between and out of sleep, your brain generates these theta waves. I don't know if any of you have ever fallen asleep, half asleep on the couch, and maybe your boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse, or other says, "Hey, you're sleeping," and you go, "No, I was just resting my eyes." Your brain was generating theta waves. When you truly fall asleep for the first time, your brain generates these electrical bursts of activity called sleep spindles. And we usually say that that is sort of the first true marker of true sleep. And then if you've ever been in, I'll answer that question about the caves in a minute. The delta waves, and they found that when you're in deep sleep, you know, that 3 a.m. in the morning, I can't wake up kind of sleep, your brain is generating these big sloppy things called delta waves, right? So, he actually discovered all the time. Are those the guys? No, those guys did not live in a cave for 30 days, although that's a great question, Ash. There are people who have done that. And so people have wanted to know what happens when you disconnect the suprachiasmatic nucleus from light. All right? So what happens when you do that? Now, we can only do that in case studies, people who have blindness, because we can't do that experimentally by destroying people's retinohypothalamic tract. Don't write that down. But what we can do, and what has been done, is to put people in an underground cave where they live without any light change during the day or night. And what you also have to do is you have to remove all of the Zeitgeibers that exist in an environment. You have to take away the clock because the clock tells you what time of day it is. You have to take away the TV because we all know that the 5 o'clock news comes on at 5 o'clock and Price is Right comes on at 11 o'clock. Don't miss that, right? So we all know these kinds of things. So you have to take away newspapers. You have to take away all of these clues that give people an idea as to what time it is. And the question is, what happens when people engage in what we call free running? And that's what they found in the cave, right, Bob Barker? Although, what's his name? Drew, what's his name? Does a pretty good job, Kircho. But when you remove all of these time givers and people engage in free running, they find that people's sleep cycle stretches just a little bit. Some people say just a little bit over 24 hours. Some people think it moves to almost 24 hours. But the whole point is, if you remove people from the light cycle, their 24-hour cycle will change a little bit. Usually gets a little bit longer. Okay, my parents saw beta waves. Okay, let me make sure I'm not missing any questions. Is the medical condition something you feel more awake in the morning if you get less sleep at night? Happens to you all the time. How do you know you're sleeping comfortably through the night on those long nights? I will say that sleep is habitual. We kind of learn patterns. Some of you are 6 to 8 hour sleepers. Some of you are 5 to 7 hour sleepers. Some of you sleep like cats, 9 and 10 hours. That's kind of interesting, Riley. Maybe you have something to focus on when you wake up on those short sleep nights. Okay? Now, so here's the brain activity that your brain generates. When you're awake, your brain's generating beta waves. When you're nodding off in class, your brain generates alpha waves. As you are transitioning to sleep, your brain generates theta waves. When you finally fall asleep, you start getting these things called sleep spindles and K complexes. And when you are deep dead asleep, your brain activity slows way down and you generate delta waves. But then what Kleitman and DeMint found was that all of these stages of sleep, which they called non-REM sleep, differed from this very crazy state that people cycle back and forth into during the night called REM sleep. And the bizarre thing was the brain actually acted like it was awake, but people would still be dead asleep. In fact, they called it paradoxical sleep because your brain was acting like you were awake and yet you were dead asleep. So they called it paradoxical sleep. And what they found is that during the night, we cycle back and forth between non-REM sleep and REM sleep 5 to 6 times a night. So if you look at this picture I've got here on the bottom, you'll notice that the 0 hour of sleep, the person is awake, and then they fall into sleep. You see where it says stage 2? This is what we call light sleep. This is when you first start seeing those sleep spindles. And we go into light sleep. And as we sleep 15, 20 minutes, our brain activity changes and it starts turning to delta sleep. And we go into what's called slow wave sleep. Now they have 2 different stages, stage 3 and stage 4. Don't worry about them. Both of them are characterized by slow brain activity. Okay, so, and then what happens is after we spend 15 or 20 minutes or 30 minutes in slow wave sleep, the brain activity starts changing again and the delta waves go away and we start seeing sleep spindles and K complexes. And our brain actually appears to be waking up. And then all of a sudden, our brain goes into this crazy state called REM sleep, where it's actually just as active as if we're awake and doing stuff during the day. And our eyes bounce back and forth, our heart rate increases, our body temperature matches the surroundings, and our blood pressure drops. And this is the craziest part. We become paralyzed by our pons. A little structure in our pons paralyzes us. And you know what happens? We dream. We have these crazy burrito, scary chili burrito kind of dreams. And so we cycle back and forth during the night. Why do we cycle back and forth? You know what? That's a good question, Addie. One of the things I do know is that when we go into slow wave sleep, okay, the cells around our arteries in our brain actually begin to shrink. And they shrink and open up spaces right beside our arteries, and cerebrospinal fluid washes through our brain and cleans out proteins and garbage. And that's why we feel awake and we feel better after we've been asleep for a while. So I think what our brain is doing is cycling through think of it as cycling through the wash cycle every night. Yes, the pons causes sleep paralysis, unless you have REM behavioral disorder, Leanne. Okay, so the pons causes sleep paralysis. Have any of you ever had that experience where you wake up and you are frozen? Anybody? And you're paralyzed just for a little bit, and then after a second you're able to move your body? That experience is because you've woken up and your pons hasn't quite let up off of your body, your paralyzed body just yet. Night terrors. Spencer asks a great question. Night terrors and night terrors and night terrors and sleepwalking actually occur in deep sleep. They do not occur in REM sleep. How about that? I'll bet that surprises you. Night terrors are different from nightmares. Nightmares are images and sort of sensations that we have during REM sleep. And night terrors is sort of a panic attack that occurs during non-REM sleep. Okay? That's a great question that we do not have the answer to, Fiery Fun Dip 67. We don't know why sleepwalking happens, although we know it's kind of common. Sleepwalking, sleep talking, and night terrors are pretty common in early childhood. I don't know if any of you have ever had a kid who's sleepwalked or been talking in their sleep. Occasionally my wife talks in her sleep. I always listen to hear if she's talking about another guy or something, right? But she never spills the beans on herself. But typically that happens to early children. I feel like I'm falling off a cliff, and the scariest thing if you ever ask me. Right. Okay, so here's the thing. You cycle back and forth about 5 to 6 times every night. We get most of our delta sleep early in the sleep period. Do you see that? So the delta sleep occurs early in the sleep cycle. And so that way, if I call you at 2 or 3 in the morning, you're going to be super duper asleep and you're not going to know what the hell I'm talking about when you pick up the phone. It's going to take you a minute to figure out where you're coming from, to wake up your consciousness. But as we move through the sleep cycle, we start spending more time in REM activity, which is when we have most of our dreams. And so that's why most of us, when we wake up, we remember dreaming. Dreaming does not engage the hippocampus. Okay, so that's why any dream image you have, you quickly forget. I don't know if any of you have the experience that when you wake up from a crazy dream, by the time you run into the other room to tell somebody, you've forgotten that dream. That's because the images, the dream images, dream memories, and dream feelings aren't processed through the hippocampus. Your sensory cortex is firing up, your thalamus is firing up, but it's not engaging the part of your memory that makes things stick in your brain. Okay? So we cycle back and forth. Now, do any of you have the experience of never dreaming? Yes, we all have to forget our dreams. Some people say they don't dream. My mom swore up and down that she didn't dream. But you know what? We all go into REM sleep. So I would say we all dream, so to speak. If you don't dream, chances are your habitual cycle of sleep must wake you up in between REM cycles. So if you want to see if you dream, set your alarm clock back 20 minutes. Try to get up 20 or 25 minutes earlier than you normally do, and see if you catch yourself in the middle of a dream. Okay, now we don't do all of our dreaming during REM sleep. It turns out that 20% of our dreams actually occur during non-REM sleep, but non-REM dreams are usually not scary, they're not visual, and they're not nearly as vivid. They're muddled, nice dreams. The scary chili burrito dreams that make you wake up and check the house, those are always REM dreams. I don't know if you have them. I remember when I was a kid, I had this dream where I would pick on the older neighbor kids. I would throw a snowball at them, and then they would start chasing me through the snow. And because the snow was so deep, they would always catch me and beat me up. Now, number one, I don't know why I dreamed about throwing snowballs at bigger kids. And number two, I don't know why I never managed to get back to the house before they beat me up. But it was a very scary recurrent dream that I had as a young kid. Now, here's the deal. If you don't sleep for a night, you do not have to sleep twice as much to make up that sleep. We do not make up sleep. However, your body does make up REM sleep. So you spend about 25% of your time at night in REM sleep. If you miss a night's worth of sleep, the only thing you need to make up is the REM sleep. And what will happen is you'll spend the same amount of time in sleep the next night, but you'll get more REM sleep. And they've actually found that if you keep somebody up long enough and keep poking them awake and awake and awake, what happens is they will eventually fall immediately into REM sleep. So they do these experiments where they put people in a sleep lab and they hook them up to the EEGs and they let them sleep. But every time they get to REM sleep, they wake them up. And so they'll let you get 8 hours of non-REM sleep, but no REM sleep. And what they find is that if you do this long enough, well, number one, these people they don't sleep well and they don't feel good and they don't have that refreshed feel. But then they also at some point just start falling straight into REM sleep. And we call this need for REM rebound. Yeah, right? So it's a horrible form of torture, Aish. Now, how the brain activity changes during REM sleep. Your frontal lobe activity is depressed. Your reasoning, planning, impulse control are decreased. Anybody notice that your dreams don't make a whole lot of logical sense? They don't make a bit of sense at all. Remember when we were talking about hallucinating your consciousness in that video this week by Anil Seth? The deal with reality, your waking consciousness, is it's tied to real signals coming at you. And so it seems and it is real. But if you've ever had your dreams, you'll notice that your dreams are super duper crazy and impossible. And wow, her dreams make sense. My dreams are always crazy. It won't be raining one minute and then it's raining the next. My friend is here and then they disappear or are a mile away. And sometimes your dreams just don't make sense. And that's because your frontal lobe, the part of your consciousness that ties all your reality together, it's tying these weird random firings in your brain that are occurring. Now, your frontal lobe activity is decreased, but your amygdala, which is your emotional center, becomes more active. And that's why your dreams are scary. Your pons becomes active and paralyzes you so you don't move while you're having these dreams. And your motor cortex and visual association areas become more active. Now, nobody knows. You know what? That's a great question. Do dreams mean something, or are dreams just random? Sigmund Freud, who we'll discuss in chapter 13, said dreams mean something, and we'll talk about that in chapter 13. But one of the more common theories is what they call the activation synthesis theory, which says that your dreams are just random electrical activity happening in your in your motor cortex and your visual association cortex, and they just get tied together. Remember, I told you that your consciousness is not created by you. It's instead created by your sensory experiences. So if your sensory experience is telling you that you're riding on a chocolate bar down a river of lava, then that's what your sleeping consciousness tells you. So does that make sense? Now, why do we dream? Why do we go into REM sleep? Some people, there's evidence to suggest in a roundabout way that sleeping is related to learning and development. So when you prevent somebody from REM sleeping, their memory isn't as good. Little children at developmentally important times of their childhood experiences surge in REM sleep. And research studies with animals have shown is that if you destroy the area in the pons that that stops your behavior, when animals dream, they move their body parts in stereotypic ways that look similar to useful behaviors in those animals. So think about it. Everybody learns to walk really well. Every last one of you is an awesome walker. Is there any other ability in the world where everybody else is awesome? And that's because walking is so developmentally important that your brain, in a sense, practices the neural movements for walking while you're asleep at night. Vision is a very complex part that puts lots of things together. So think about it. Maybe your brain is practicing organizing vision at night. And so we think that REM sleep is actually important in terms of building neural connections that help us learn complex behaviors. I trip over my own feet, Professor. Maybe you need to spend more time sleeping and dreaming, Fiery Fun Dip. You know, that's a good point, Adenek. I don't think I ever see people's faces in dreams, so maybe they are blurred out. That's probably a limitation of the fusiform gyrus, which maybe it's not quite as active as it should be. Maybe it's not integrated with the image as well as it should be when you're sleeping. But faceless people, how scary is that, Spencer? And so the idea is that the brain isn't inactive at night. Your brain is sometimes more active while you're dreaming than it is while you're sitting here relaxing, listening to a lecture. So keep that in mind on Friday as you do the Neuromatrix contest. Oh, by the way, Neuromatrix hint: beta waves and sleep spindles and beta waves and alpha waves and delta waves in REM sleep might be important. The pons might be important. I don't know. So, let's see. I read somewhere that your brain can't come up with faces on its own. You know, I'm sitting here trying to imagine my wife right now, and I'm having trouble drawing her picture up in my mind. That's a hell of a point. You know, Aish, there has been a debate in cognitive psychology in terms of whether or not we store information graphically or abstractly. So when you think of a rabbit, do you think of the picture of a rabbit? Does a picture of a rabbit pop up in your mind, or do the attributes of a rabbit pop up in your mind? That's a good question. Interesting. I'm always twitch when falling asleep. Interesting. All right, so here's the deal. Let's talk a little bit about how sleep changes over the lifespan, okay? Now, we all know that babies sleep a ton. Babies sleep twice as much as the average adult. 16 to 20 hours a day is the average amount of sleep that a baby is going to have. Now, the thing that stinks about this for parents is you'll notice that they're not entrained into the sun. Their little hypothalamic tract hasn't myelinated yet, and so they don't have the functioning of their suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's not myelinated yet, so babies sleep 2 hours now, 6 hours later, 4 hours. They sleep whenever they want, and a baby might be dead asleep during the day and ready to play at night, and then the next night they switch around. And so they sleep a lot of hours a day. Not only do they sleep a lot of hours, but they spend an awful lot of time in REM sleep, which is one of the factors that leads us to the idea that maybe REM sleep is important for the development of neural connections. So infants spend 50% of their time in REM sleep, and that drops down to about 25% for adults, and that's going to stay consistent throughout your life. Now, I do suggest that as you get older, into your 50s or 60s, you're going to need less sleep than you did when you were younger. And this is true. Now, the crazy thing is, your delta sleep starts disappearing in your mid to late 50s. And this is why almost half of all older adults are going to report sleep disorders, sleep problems of some type. I didn't get as good sleep tonight. I can't ever sleep, etc., etc., etc. This is why when you go to grandma and grandpa's house, you have to be super duper quiet at night because it's easy to wake them up out of their sleep. It turns out that delta sleep activity goes away in your brain in the 50s and 60s. I didn't sleep well. Oh no, Morgan, I am so sorry. Did you ever go look and find out? I think it's that your brain sends some electrical impulses to check if your body parts are still there. You know what, Etta? I'm sure you have sensory reactions as well as motor reactions. That's a great point, Etta. I think that's a great idea. Babies do get the sleep, huh? And so, did you ever go to the doctor about sleep problems, Maga? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about sleep disorders. Good sleep is essential for health. Holy cow, Riley, you sound like a Marine. 4 hours of sleep and feeling awesome. I have to have at least 6. I don't need any more than 6, but if I get 5, I'm a fumbling idiot. So I couldn't be like you, Riley. Spencer, do you have a CPAP, or have you've had one, Spencer? So, sleep disturbances actually are a common feature in many psych disorders. When we get to chapter 14 and talk about psych disorders, there are lists of features for each of the psych disorders. So if you know if someone has schizophrenia or depression or bipolar. And what you're going to find is that almost every psychological disorder is rooted in some sort of sleep problem. Sleeping too much, not sleeping enough, insomnia, etc., etc. So good sleep is essential not only for intellectual functioning and to do a good job at your job, but also for your psychological health. So Riley, get yourself some sleep, man. Wow, you went to sleep therapy. That was like a biological therapy. Somebody wasn't talking to you about sleep, were they? I wouldn't have heard of that. Go ahead and describe that if you would in the chat bar while I talk, Morgan. Okay. Yeah, so some people have insomnia. Do you consistently spend more than 15 or 20 minutes trying to go to sleep? Do you? If you do, you in a sense may be described as having sleep onset insomnia. 12 to 20% of adults seem to suffer from this, and it is associated with depression. It turns out that the more you worry about it and the more you think about it, the harder it is to get to sleep. Oh, wow. So yes, CBT is the most, so obviously they sent you to cognitive behavioral therapy. So they talk to you about the anxieties related to sleep and maybe help you work through them and develop some more healthy habits related to sleep. That's interesting, Morgan. Huh. An hour to so to fall asleep. Really? DBT as well, Spencer? Okay. Yeah, if the baby's there, it keeps you up. That's kind of, that's a bummer. The weird thing is your thalamus, which is the sensory integrator that allows you to sense and feel things. Actually, melatonin, in the pons, I should say, there's this circuit that goes from your pons to your thalamus, and your pons sort of shuts your thalamus down at night while you sleep too. And that's why you don't hear things or see things or feel things when you're asleep. Okay? Wow, okay, so Spencer King's done both CBT and DBT. So you have had therapy for insomnia. Now, I don't think sleep apnea responds so much to therapy. It's most common in middle-aged adult men, especially men who have a little bit of weight around the gut. And typically it's related to breathing problems. Turns out you have a structure in your pons which measures the oxygen level in your breath. In your blood. When your oxygen level dips too low, your pons shakes you awake and causes you to take a deep breath, restoring the oxygen level in your body. This keeps you from dying for lack of breathing while you sleep, because even though you sleep, your brain still needs to make sure you breathe and keep your oxygen levels up. So what happens in people with sleep apnea? Oxygen levels drop low, your brain wakes you up, messes you up in your sleep cycle, and it messes up that nice cycle that you have. You go back to sleep. In fact, some people may not even be aware that they wake up during the night. From what I heard, you can wake up a couple of times a night to hundreds of times a night. Do any of you who have had a CPAP and have done a sleep study, did they tell you how many times a night you woke up? I always like to ask that question. Some students can tell me, some students don't, and it's always surprising to hear. So the best treatment for this is to maybe lose a little weight, or they give you the CPAP machine. My dad has the CPAP machine. He is a horrible snorer. He had that kind of snoring related to his breathing problems that would cause him to wake the entire house up. I swear to God, they were like earthquake-like snores. From my dad. So you haven't done a sleep study, huh? Well, I'm not sure if it always happens. I just know that that's one of the risk factors for it. So don't get too bent out of shape if you're not a size 4. I wouldn't worry at all. Now, what you saw today was that video of the gentleman with narcolepsy. Now, here's the crazy thing. If you measure a narcoleptic's brain with the EEG, what you're going to find is that they do not have the sweet cyclical nature of the sleep cycle like all of us do. Their brain may not go into REM sleep. Their brain is all acyclical and doesn't have this nice cycle of deep sleep and REM sleep during the night. So their brain isn't actually able to achieve the necessary REM sleep during the night. Remember, I talked to you about REM rebound. At some point, your body sort of wants to get REM. And so what happens is these people will fall directly from beta waves, focused concentration, all the way into REM sleep in an instant. And what you'll notice is that the gentleman who suffers from cataplexy, he falls down. And I told you the pons, its job is to make your muscles flaccid when you go into REM sleep. So as soon as he goes into REM sleep, he loses muscle tone, and that causes him to fall. And so that's why you get the associated cataplexy that goes with the narcolepsy. All right, so it causes them to fall over. There is no treatment for this. These people, kind of like this gentleman, they need to have somebody kind of help them with their day-to-day life. One of the things that you could try to do, I guess, is to try to restrict the range of emotions that you feel. Try to stay calm, but trying to restrict your emotions is kind of like trying to stop breathing, I would imagine, right? Whenever he gets real excited, he knocks out. It was so scary driving with him for the first time because I definitely thought, and that's the thing. There are some people like D. Dodd. D. Dodd's narcolepsy comes on so easily, there's no way he could drive, right? Somebody pulls out in front of him, he'd fall asleep and wreck immediately, right? So now, we did talk about REM behavioral disorder. I mentioned it in passing earlier. Now, this area in the pons, just like you can have brain damage or problems with different parts or circuits of your brain, there are some people whose pons doesn't effectively cause them to go flaccid during their REM period, and these people thrash out and can often hurt themselves and their sleep partner during REM sleep. And there is a medicine to help people who are suffering from RBD, REM behavioral disorder. And then it does sound like the scariest thing. Could you imagine sleeping beside somebody who beats you up every day? And while they were dreaming, when somebody starts to attack them, they start to beat you up. Now, this is different from sleepwalking or sleep talking. I remember my older brother when he was like 8 or 9. My parents told me that they actually woke up with him in their bed, running in place and screaming and yelling. That's an extreme case of sleepwalking and sleep talking. Now, remember, sleepwalking and sleep talking and night terrors are A, more common in children, and B, they are delta sleep activities. They are not REM sleep activities. They occur during the slowest period of electrical activity in your brain. That's crazy, Leanne. So she smacked you, huh? Got to put some boxing gloves on her. All right, that's the end of my lecture. Remember, I told you sleep is controlled by brain structure, specifically the suprachiasmatic nucleus and the pineal gland, which releases melatonin, which causes a cascade of effects in your brain. Your thalamus shuts down so that you don't see and hear and feel things while you sleep, and your pons paralyzes you so that you don't thrash about while you dream. Your brain's electrical activity changes in its patterns as you change in your level of aroused, from focusing to being zoned out to being dead asleep. And our brain cycles through these different periods of electrical activity during the night in a very systematic way, 5 or 6 times a night. And this pattern changes as we get older. Remember, when you go into REM sleep, your brain actually becomes more active than it would be at resting, with the exception of your frontal lobe, which is why your dreams seem so crazy, and your hippocampus, which is why you can't remember your dreams. And then I suggested to you that there are problems that occur in this cyclical process called sleep. Some are quite simple and go away, like sleep terrors that you'll see in kids and aren't that necessarily that serious, all the way up to narcolepsy, which is a very serious sleep disorder that can impair a person's total life functioning. All right. Very good. Thank you very much for coming to my lecture. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me a text or an email. But until next week, have a great weekend. Hey, don't forget to do the neuromatrix. You should have all you need to score really high today. All right? So take care until next time.